You're watching Foreign Affairs with me, Blessed Sogah. Welcome to our viewers in Ghana and around the world. The United Nations is marking 77 years of its historic signing of the United Nations Charter. The San Francisco Agreement gave flesh to the international organization that will guide and shape a new international world order. For the past 77 years of its existence, the United Nations has grown and proven to be a time-tested multilateral platform, having given the opportunity for interstate dialogue. However, in his address to the world, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, indicated that the organization is being tested like never before in the wake of the escalating tension between Russia and Ukraine. Well, many countries, including Ghana, have been marking the day with a flag-raising ceremony to reaffirm the principles of solidarity and a peaceful international order which member states subscribe to. And on this first edition of Foreign Affairs, we pay a glowing tribute to Kofi Annan, the Ghanaian diplomat who served as the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations from 1997 to 2006. He is widely acclaimed as the embodiment of the United Nations and what the organization aspires to be. Well, in his tribute to his predecessor, Antonio Guterres noted that Kofi Annan was the United Nations and the United Nations was Kofi Annan. So I want to bring in now one man who was there and monitored all of this, Adama Gaye, a Senegalese author, who joins us to share his account of how it was working with Kofi Annan and watching him closely serve as Secretary General to the United Nations. Adama Gaye, welcome to Foreign Affairs. I need to find out from you, first of all, how difficult was it at the time back in 1996 when Kofi Annan made his intentions clear that he was going to contest the Secretary General position?
He may not have thought of becoming the boss of the UN because 5 years earlier to his election, which occurred in 1996, there was another African who had been elected to run the organization in the person of the Egyptian Boutros Ghali. Boutros Ghali was elected in November 1991 with the help of the French, who insisted that the diplomatic dimension of the French language should be taken into account, and that's how Francois Mitterrand, then French president, pushed his candidature to become the Secretary General. I asked him that question on the eve of Boutros Ghali's election. Mr. President, are you introducing conditionality, linguistic conditionality for the selection of international civil servant? Mr. Mitterrand stared at me and said, yes, yes, yes. The next day, Boutros Ghali was elected. But the problem with Boutros Ghali was that he's a very strong character and he wanted to change the world. And what he started doing, including attacking some position in key areas of countries like the United States, particularly in the Middle East, even offending Israel. And suddenly, the Clinton administration that was then in place, and particularly its Secretary of State, Mrs. Madeleine Albright, started to reject, to hate Mr. Boutros Ghali. And progressively, they said they will not allow him to be elected Secretary General for a second term. Therefore, came a problem for Africa because Africa, in the norms of the United Nations system, was supposed to have a second term, 5 years term, to run the organization as is the rule, unspoken rule. But many wanted to eject Africa from having that role. The African Union, then the OAU, under Salim Salim, wanted Mr. Boutros Ghali to be given a second term. The American administration said no. So Mr. Annan kept a very low profile. I recall meeting him one day in the subway in New York, and I had written a piece against Mr. Boutros Ghali for the role he misused his position and not helped properly Africa. And Mr. Annan told me, Mr. Guy, you raised legitimate questions in your piece. And now we became friends. What happened was Mr. Annan was progressively getting some underground support when obviously the official people didn't want to back his candidature. Down the line, people recall jokingly that it was during a night at the UN Security Council meeting when everybody was tired that Mrs. Albright banged on the table of the Security Council and said, "Pause, Kofi." And people believe that she supported Kofi Annan. And somebody said, "Bring in Kofi Annan." And they say, that's how he elected. Besides the joke, the reality is that he was the sole candidate that was really prepared to take over the job. He was prepared. He had the support of the great countries, despite the lack of support from Africa. And personally, I recall I was one of the very few to support him, to the point when the BBC Newsnight, the biggest TV show in America, sent a crew to interview me in New York, where I explained why it's important to have a black African face everywhere in offices of the United Nations. And that's to a large extent what happened. And Kofi Annan was elected in November 1996. I recall speaking to him at the night of his victory. I was in Jakarta at the Islamic Summit Conference, and he told me he was elated. "This is your victory," he told me. He was a gentleman.
And what would you say were some of Kofi Annan's most upheld principles within that time amid criticisms from people who felt he could have done better for Africa?
So, to talk about Kofi Annan, you have to define him physically, first of all. This person is a very composed gentleman, a very quiet, smooth person. He is somebody who listens. He is a negotiator. And you can see that he was able to deliver on many things, including when he first went to Iraq to negotiate a peace deal that the Americans, despite his success, when he returned to New York, he said, "We have a deal." The Americans didn't want that. They wanted to go to war, maybe because of the oil in Iraq, because maybe they wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein. But Kofi Annan had done his job. He was truly a very diplomatic leader who knew through and through the United Nations. So he was prepared for this job from his early years when he joined the organization in Geneva. Now, people say that he didn't deliver much for Africa. I think sometimes people expect from the Secretary General of the United Nations to be a general and not the secretary he is supposed to be, responding to the will and sometimes the whims of those countries that sit at the Security Council, and sometimes the willingness of the General Assembly to support him. So, despite the difficulties, Mr. Annan was able to represent well the continent, and this is what he did for Africa. This is job well done, despite some hiccups. For instance, his son's Kojo involvement in the oil for deal money, which is the low aspect of Annan's tenure, despite the fact that also people continued to blame him for his inaction in Rwanda. I traveled with him, by the way, to Rwanda. We went to the Museum of the Genocide and we met Kagame. I could see that Annan has been a good Secretary General of the UN because he represented well the image of Africa, and to a large extent even, up till today, the person whose name is most remembered as former Secretary General or late Secretary General of the United Nations, clearly Kofi Annan is one of them. So to a large extent, we need to hail his tenure of the United Nations. He is one of the best ever that not only Africa but world produced to be running the United Nations. And also, he helped produce some of the key aspects that the UN is still running on. The Millennium Development Goals, the peacekeeping operation that he extended to regional organization, the role of preventive diplomacy, is a smooth and a diplomatic, tactful way of approaching powerful nations to bringing them to solutions. So until now, I think the world regrets his absence from the diplomatic scene. It would have helped bring about maybe solutions to these places that are really hot from Ukraine to Libya, across Africa and around the world. He was the ultimate diplomat to run the Secretary General of the UN. Annan's principle, we could say that they derived from his personality. This man was a very, very calm person, capable to listen, but very strict. He would not do something that he was not willing to do. And that's what I saw in him as a person who could give the impression to be soft, that people could bully him, force him to do certain things. But ultimately, if you look at his track record, he never did anything that would negate his principle and his personality. So that's what I would say about him. And he was a gentleman. I saw him during our trip. He was always respectful to his staff. He was always trying to bring people working with him, around him, involving them, uh, trying to avoid falling into the nepotism that is, to a large extent, unfortunately, the hallmark of African leadership. And really, he had a bird's view of the world. So he could discuss of all issues. And that's literally what made him a refined, a top diplomat that the world is still yearning for.
The United Nations, as the Secretary General has pointed to, is being tested like never before. What reforms should we be looking at in terms of making the UN much more inclusive?
To reform the United Nations, it's clear that the world needs to return to the drawing board. One of the aspects to doing so is to convene another Dumbarton Oaks or another San Francisco conference where people will sit and discuss the problem of the 21st century that are not the problem of the 20th century. When the UN was created, it was about avoiding the recurrence of another war in the world, a European cold global world war. So that's what the world wanted. The world wanted also to avoid Armageddon, the problem that could be generated by the heated ideological war that happened in the world from 1946 after Churchill said that there is a curtain being raised, forced in Eastern Europe. He made that speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. Then since then, the world has been in search of a soul to redefine itself. The bipolar world between the former Soviet Union and America, the two main ideological contender running the ideological camps of communism and capitalism, that world is gone. The unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union that made America the sole superpower in the world is gone. We have now a new world, and we have countries like China, Russia, Turkey, you name it, trying to claim their seat at the United Nations, where they have been excluded. And this is the case also for Africa. And some countries who had been invited to sit at the Security Council, like France, after the Second World War, they are no longer relevant in terms of their capacity. Even then, they were even smuggled into that seat with the help of the Western nations. So today, there is a need to bring back real diplomacy, great game, as we used to say, to sit down and discuss how to go about it, how to ensure that the Security Council is reopened, a new form of Security Council is devised for peace, security, but also to involve other demographic aspect, the youngsters, the women, to make sure that some evolution, technological aspects that are reframing the world are taken into account, and also to reshape the UN system overall, because some of the organizations are pursuing overlapping missions. They have become a huge bureaucracy like the UNDP, UNICEF. Somehow is more talking shop than delivering on results. So Africa should be somehow one of the proponents that would call for a seat of Africa at the UN Security Council. To do so, I think that there is, in the principle, an agreement. What Africa should insist on is that at least to have a seat for the African Union representing Africa, to have also African regional organization like ECOWAS, SADC, and you name it, be uh, considered as observers or full members sitting on behalf of those regional organizations. I believe that also we must ensure that the UN become more nimble, more effective, serving the state, the nation states, instead of trying to occupy the driving seat, like some of the organizations created after the Second World War, like the World Bank or the IMF, are trying to do by controlling the economies and even the politics of most of our nations. So these changes should be done, and this can only come from a candid conversation about the state of the world, an acknowledgement that what the UN was created for, it has achieved some, but not all, and some of the shortcomings, we need to fix them by bringing together the new dynamics groups and forces, social forces, intellectual forces, in order to reframe the world in which we should be living, including climate, including other aspects that are very important in our 21st century. Unfortunately, so far, you can hear leaders, including African leaders, talking about those things, but it's just paying lip services in order to gain somehow points at home. But if you want to do that, you have to be serious about it. And first of all, America, China, Russia, the European Union, and Africa, Latin American countries, the Middle East should be involved in this transition to a new system of a new architecture of the international community. And I think because of the problem that we have encountered, COVID, terrorism, and other challenges that are transnational, there is a need to go beyond the nation states that defined the first organization, not only of the United Nations, but of the League of Nations that was created in 1919 after the Versailles Conference following the First World War. This time around, it has to be a big tent open to all the new stakeholders that are in their rightful position to demand a voice in the running of the international affairs of the world, and to be sure that their preoccupation, their challenges are taken into account in whatever decision and deliberation is made around fixing this 21st century world that is really very shaky at this very moment.
And I am sure that you've worked closely with Kofi Annan. What are some of the memories that you have of him?
The memory I keep with Kofi Annan is that of a gentleman. One day, I was traveling with him. We had left Dar es Salaam and we were going to Sudan. In that first African trip that he made in 1997, we had visited 8 countries, including Rwanda, where in the first instance, Kagame shunned him because he said Mr. Annan, in the speech he made when we arrived there at the parliament, he didn't apologize for the genocide. Annan, the next day, visited the Museum of Genocide. We went there, 50 kilometers from Kigali, and then Kagame met him. That's a sign of humility from him, because people in his delegation were shouting in the night, "We have to leave." They did not come to the reception. Annan stayed cool and fixed the problem and ended up becoming a friend of Kagame, knowing that the UN failed Rwanda in the first place in 1994. Then I was traveling with him on that plane from Dar es Salaam to Sudan. Sudan was a country that was banned, outlawed by the Clinton administration. In the middle of the flight, at one point, Annan left his seat and came, sat with me, discussing with me. One of his staff, who used to be the head of the UN in Congo, said to me, "Oh, he came to seek audience with you. You are a lucky person." Actually, it was not me, it was him, that he was a gentleman, thoroughly. Last but not the least, anywhere you would see Annan, he would be composed. He was able to talk to everybody. He was open-minded person. He was truly the type of African that made Africa proud.
Adamagaye, thank you for your time here on Foreign Affairs. Well, as UN marked its 77th anniversary, I had a sit-down conversation with Charles Abani, resident coordinator of the United Nations here in Ghana. He spoke to me about his tour of duty and what the UN is doing to partner countries such as Ghana and to make the world a better place for everyone. Charles Abani, thank you for talking to JoyNews.
My pleasure.
The United Nations is 77. Obviously, I'm not sure you're 70, so you may not have been around when it all started. But what's your personal impression about how the UN has fared over the period? And in times where experts say we're in a changing world order, what's your impression?
Thank you. I've had a checkered career, largely in the development sector, and more recently in the UN. And I joined very excited in 2020 because of the opportunity it offers, and I feel it's a real privilege. The United Nations is the symbol of multilateral collaboration across the world. It's probably the single most influential organization. It's well respected here in Ghana and has a long history of collaboration, progress, and support, and achievements as well. So it's a privilege to be part of the UN, and I think the UN is set to do more.
And in fact, a lot of messages have been flowing ever since. You're just returning from an event where you delivered your own message, but the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres himself, has a message for the world, and I just want to quote portions of what he says. He says, quote, "Our organization," and I believe he's referring to the United Nations, "is being tested like never before." The belief is he was referring to the well-known Russian-Ukrainian crisis. It must be a tough time for you at the United Nations, isn't it?
Yes, you know, we live in very challenging times. During the last UN General Assembly, I think Ghana's own president spoke about the difficulties that we face today. And in fact, we all know globally that there have been a series of shocks that in a sense have created a perfect storm. We've had the COVID pandemic. On top of that, significant socioeconomic impacts arising from that, many of which are felt largely in developing countries, and Ghana is no exception. And on top of that, we've had what you might call a failure of trust. Trust in the United Nations system to be able to resolve international conflict that has resulted in the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think it's true that there are questions being asked. But also the UN General Assembly unanimously reaffirmed that if there was a time for multilateralism, now is the time. The challenges we face are significant. Growing inequality across the world, the climate crisis and its impacts, none of which can be resolved at national level. Growing financial crisis, particularly for developing countries. And as I've said, if you like, geopolitical divides that mean that the world is actually quite divided. So at a time like this, it is difficult to gain consensus, but nonetheless, the globe, and remember the United Nations is a committee of nations, The reaffirmation was clear. We need the United Nations. Maybe we need the United Nations 2.0, but we do need
We certainly need the United Nations. And I guess that's why the Secretary General says there is hope. Is there really hope?
Absolutely, there's hope. I mean, let's just take the immediate Russia-Ukraine crisis and the grain corridor that's been created, and hundreds of millions of tons of grain already lifted from within a conflict context to bring to particularly developing countries where market prices have been volatile and young people have been devastated by increasing food prices, increasing energy prices. I think there is hope. In times of darkness, often one forgets, as they say, it is darkest before the dawn, and then there is a new dawn.
But then there are some who are skeptical about the African continent, and it includes some of your own organizations. The UNDP, for instance, is reporting that Africa, quote, is facing a double crisis. I believe here they're referring to the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. It's beginning to have a direct impact on countries such as Ghana. I recall our president saying, every bullet, every bomb that hits Ukraine hits our pocket directly. How is the UN intending to scale up support for African countries such as Ghana?
So first of all, like with COVID, you know, there were many challenges that COVID created. But while we deal with the challenges, we should also look for the opportunities. And we should also look for the lessons. So absolutely, the world is probably at its worst in a generation. But at the same time, there's opportunity here and there's lessons. Africa needs to learn how to become more resilient in the face of these challenges. I think Ghana's own ambition for self-reliance is a model that we all need to look at. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, and again, let's quote the president, we must never be caught with our pants down again. And so these are some of the lessons that I think are coming home to us, and therefore the opportunities that we must see. Certainly the General Assembly has reaffirmed its commitment to non-aggression, to the sovereignty and rights of nations. And of course, in those difficult circumstances, war is continuing. But I think the UN has played a very pivotal role in trying to unblock supply chains and make sure that grain, fertilizer is able to reach the right places, and look at how to support the whole crisis around energy as well. We have COP27 coming up, where there is quite a lot of demand to ensure that the 100 billion pledge from Glasgow is met, because that is the basis upon which countries who are on the brink of breakthrough, Ghana being one, can actually make the investments that are necessary to actually drive themselves into middle-income status and help the globe to achieve net zero.
We'll talk about some of these partnerships shortly, but I still just want to dwell on that document. I guess it's titled The Impact of the War in Ukraine on Sustainable Development in Africa. That's the UNDP document I'm talking about. There's another fear that Africa may still go through the quote-unquote dependency cycle. It's part of the criticisms that have faced the United Nations over the year. The fact that you've not been able to breach the North-South divide. How do you respond to such critics?
So I think that the Secretary General and the UN has called for a number of systemic level responses. One is the need to really reform the global financial architecture that we work within. As we speak, we're already predicting that next year will bring a debt crisis that has arisen from some of the impacts of COVID-19, and certainly the kind of growth that we expected on the continent has not happened. Sluggish recovery from COVID-19, impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war means that many countries are going to face debt defaults unless we review and come up with different ways of looking at how to finance the globe more fairly. We know, for instance, that when the SDRs were distributed, Africa got the least. And actually the question is, why are the countries who need this most not able to get it? Certainly the Secretary General is behind a call for a fairer financial system. I think the second element of this is really on the big issues, the big global issues, particularly on climate, where no one country can solve this problem on its own. Really ensuring that we hold countries to account to their commitments, particularly to funding adaptation and creating some of the financial flows that will enable developing countries not only to meet net zero, but to continue with their own development aspirations at the same time. So it is a complex time, I agree, but I think that all the essence is in there. Next year, we'll be having the SDG review, and Ghana just completed the voluntary national review this year, and progress is there on many indicators, and there are priorities and areas, infrastructure that need significant financing if we're to make them climate resilient for the future. But I don't think it's a cup half empty. I think it's a cup half full.
2030, I guess that's the ultimate vision.
Yes.
Are we far from achieving the SDGs?
So I think globally we have to accept that these two major shocks have dealt a blow to the ambitions around the Sustainable Development Goals. But we also need to look to innovation to see how we can accelerate. For example, on financing, discussing how we talk about swaps instead of debt restructuring, because restructuring is useful and helpful, but merely postpones the inevitable day and somebody has to pick up the bill. Another important thing about that is that we have to secure the future. For the future generation, Africa's population is predominantly young, and so creating debt for the next generation doesn't really solve any of the problems. Right. So finding, for instance, swaps that work between financing and nature, the continent is actually part of the carbon sink that the world needs. How do we refinance this? How do we talk about loss and damage? And all of these conversations are coming up, and the African Union and Ghana and many African countries have robust advocacy positions to be taken there. So we need to see the finances flow globally, and then we need to see the action happen at country level. But I think that the trajectory is not one of doom and gloom. There is hope there, and there are certainly big lessons. Africa should not and must not in the next 5 years be in a position where it is facing food price hikes as a result of crisis.
So you are equally concerned about Africa.
Absolutely.
Because it's always about
Absolutely.
Africa. The criticism, for instance, against the MDGs, I believe, was that it favored the East and not Africa. We're inching closer and closer to the SDG timeline, and the belief once more is that Africa is still left behind.
So I think there are lots of opportunities for us. Ghana is on the forefront, for instance, around the digital transformation. I think, as the world changes and we move fully into this fourth generation economic revolution that we're facing.
But realistically, is there a place for Africa in this SDG?
Africa is at the core of the SDGs, because I think that, by the way, the SDGs describe what every African or every normal human being should have.
Right.
If you like, SDG 1 to 5 talks about your basic rights to water, to not die of hunger, to gender equality, to education, to health. The next set between sort of SDG 8 and 15 really talk about the places where investments can be made. And I think even through CARES or Batampa, for instance, there is a strong effort to say, how do we bring in the private sector? How do we create the engine that actually then allows those rights articulated in SDGs 1 to 7 to be realized? And 16, of course, we know strong institutions are extremely important. Ghana is a relative high player in that scene on the continent here. But how do we strengthen institutions to a point that they become reliable? And how do we build these new partnerships, SDG 17? So I think all of this is extremely relevant for Ghana. I don't think there's a single part of the UN that is Eurocentric or particularly any-centric. I think now that we have experienced Africans in positions across the United Nations, I think there's a bit of a myth that the UN is set up for.
But you know that a lot of African leaders will take you on just the point you raise about stronger institutions, for instance. The belief is we need to start from within. Africa wants to be, quote and unquote, in the boardroom. The UN Security Council has enormous powers, and yet African countries are not giving that chance to be part of the permanent seats. What's the UN doing about the calls, the continuous pressure for some reform, at least to give Africa a voice?
I think the demand and the call is absolutely right. And I think the circumstances and context that we find ourselves in reaffirm absolutely that it is right that Africa and the rest of the world has a place. And if you remember when the Secretary General came into office, he promised 3 aspects of reform. The first was the reform of the Security Council. Ghana is now on that Security Council again after having served meritoriously previously. And again, I have no doubt that the President and the Ghana government, in liaison with all the members which they represent there, particularly from this constituency, are pushing hard. And the lessons are there. And so I do come back to my point that we recognize very much the global financial system needs reform. It is not stacked in the favor of developing countries. The Security Council is another area that needs reform. These points are very clearly at the heart of the global aspects of what the UN does in terms of trying to push for reform. So yes, these things take time. And in fact, the term UN 2.0 is being coined in a sense to reflect the point that we are at. We're at that point where actually, unless we reform these 2 structures, the world will remain broken in the way that it is. And we can't continue like this because unless we do that, crises will expand. We will be faced with more climate-related disasters, both natural and man-made, and we will just find ourselves with an increasing number of people who are poor. I think the globe is very aware of the urgency of this and where Africa sits. And I feel confident that the African Union and countries will be placing their points very clearly, both at COP27 that is coming up shortly, and I think next year when we talk about aid effectiveness in that big meeting on aid effectiveness, these issues will be at the forefront and the globe will have to respond. Bearing in mind still though, that the whole globe is facing a financial recession, and indeed, when we look at the impacts of energy and soaring prices, they aren't restricted to African countries, they are a global phenomenon.
The world is catching on to UN at 77. Ghana has its own team. It's building on 3S, that's solidarity, sustainability, and science. So I want us to talk about solidarity and where do we find the expression in the international system?
So really, I mean, at the essence of this, it comes out of UNGA 77, which really has reaffirmed the need for global solidarity. Unless we identify with emerging countries' needs, unless we identify with the different crises that different countries are facing, and come to the table to have generative conversations. And I say generative because often we hold oppositional conversations, my position, your position, my position, but what we need is generative conversations there, that aren't even necessarily compromised, that look for solutions to these problems. What is the underlying driver of conflict, inequality, the sense of injustice, right? What are the underlying factors that prevent African economies from rising out and becoming middle-income countries? And how are the chips stacked in certain directions? We have to redress these. And these really are at the core of solidarity, because you need solidarity to be able to do that. And that segues right into sustainability. Because unless we do that, then we're in a band-aid mode and we're in a deja vu where we just see ourselves coming back at each other.
I want to take you back 2 years, right? When you arrived in this country. It was in the peak of the pandemic, I believe. But you found your way into Ghana and you met some of our officials. When you met the foreign minister at the time you arrived, you made a pledge to support the people of Ghana to realize the Ghana Beyond Aid agenda. I just want to quote excerpts, if you would allow me. So you say the United Nations stands strongly through the work of WHO and all agencies that we have, and to support the government of Ghana in the mission to fight the pandemic and continue to develop Ghana within the framework of the Ghana Beyond Aid agenda. How are you working around this?
So a few points here. First, if I look at what I pledged, I was very strong on my belief, and I think this is up and down, that the UN must be more accountable to the countries for whom it works.
Right.
And this, if you like, horizontal accountability, rather than upward accountability to New York and the UN systems, is extremely important. And so, in a sense, Ghana's priorities and Ghana's concerns must be the priorities and concerns of the UN. I think at the time I made that statement, we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and WHO and UNICEF have been very core to the work of overcoming the pandemic. That doesn't undermine the important work done by other agencies as well. But Ghana was beneficiary, first COVAX beneficiary on the continent. Right. In fact, first COVAX beneficiary full stop. Right. And I think now we have a situation in which Ghana has vaccines available, has crossed the 50% threshold in terms of people who have been received vaccinations. And at least for now, unless we see a new version of COVID-19, Ghana has kind of overcome the immediate health issues. But building deeper resilience in the health system is at the core of this. So how do we support Ghana on its desire to acquire vaccine production capacity, to deepen its pharmaceutical industry? So that as these value chains, or if you like, supply chains get blocked in the future, Ghana is in a better position. Potentially the sub-region and the continent are in a better position. And certainly we welcome all the efforts of the President and the team to really build particularly African alliances and initiatives that seek to address these longer term, if you like, resilience capacity. And if you speak to the Ghana's own vision, the R in WISER is about resilience, to build that resilience. I want to go back briefly though on the third S. We didn't talk about science.
The science aspect.
Because again, I think this is at the core, and certainly even the Voluntary National Review makes this point, that unless we invest in science, we will not be fit for the future. And so the ability of African countries, Ghana included, is essential for us to be. We have entered now a knowledge economy where technology is driving everything from vaccine production all the way through to the creative industries and, if you like, communications and the way we communicate. There are a raft of programs that we're running here in Ghana, but it's really essential that every country makes that investment. Investing in research and development, investing in higher education, investing in institutions that produce knowledge and that are able to then be at the cutting edge and at the forefront is so critical. So we say that to Ghana repeatedly, that these investments, and it's tough times, people are trying to get food, and you're talking about investing in science and future technology.
So you've been hearing the arguments all around.
We hear all these arguments, but you know, these are what is going to work sustainably over the long haul. And in these difficult times, which investments are going to be most catalytic? These are the questions. Because if we just focus on everything, and we focus on not looking for those things that can really drive transformation, and particularly help a younger generation, who are the bulk of the population here, will not be fit in the future.
So let's talk about the future then. You've been working quite a lot and also having fun at the Global Citizens Festival.
I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. And over there, you pledged the UN support to continue to work with the Republic of Ghana. About 2.6 million Ghana cedis, billion Ghana cedis, in terms of the pledge that you're making for stronger partnerships. Is this part of the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework? Because we understand that's also in motion.
Yes. So the last period of the UN Cooperation Framework was 2018 and ends at the end of 2022. And in that period, a total of 440 odd million US dollars was spent over that 5-year period in support of Ghana's agenda. We realigned, and we're in the process of now finalizing and agreeing a 3-year program to run from 2023 to 2025, which in actual fact represents over 500 million. So this is a gross increase in the value of assistance that would come through the UN system into Ghana. The 261 million that we announced at Global Citizen is the core part of that has been secured already. The rest we are in the motions of raising that funding. So with a reduced period from 5 years to 3 years, we're seeing a significant increase in investment from the UN, which backs my pledge in 2020 that we stand ready to support. And in the short term, we've been working, for instance, with the Ministry of Agriculture, with National Planning, with the Ministry of Finance to look at how to address some of the impacts that you identified in the UNDP.
Because I was about asking of the priority areas and where you'd be focusing much more on.
So the way we did this, first we did a review of what have we learned.
Right.
And this is really useful. We need to align better with government processes. We need to ensure that we are investing in the things that matter most.
Right.
We should stop just investing in everything, but actually focus around the things that are important. We should work more on really strengthening Ghana's institutions and the capacity of Ghanaians, so that the UN actually ultimately would probably still be here, but in a very much smaller form, with Ghanaians leading the future, as is indeed the confident ambition of the country. And that we must invest more in partnerships with the private sector, with civil society, as well as continuing our collaboration with government. Key areas, of course, financing for the SDGs.
Right.
It's a lot of money that's needed. The government estimated $45 billion would be needed to meet this requirements. Economic growth that is inclusive and transformative, really important. Climate transformations across the board, not just in business, but across the board. And digital transformation. These are key areas where we think it's important. So how have we summarized that in our proposal, which we hope the government will sign shortly? 3 main strategies. Inclusive economic transformation. Inclusive because actually 80% of Ghana's business sector is informal. 70% of that 80% is actually women.
Yeah.
How do we get money to the right people and support them and create an enabling environment for those businesses to thrive? So that's area 1. The second area is equitable access to basic services that have a basic quality. And this really speaks to making sure that no one is left behind, that there is equity and access across the whole country to basic services, health, education, water and sanitation, social protection, and so forth, and nutrition, and really ensuring that we reach the nooks and crannies. And the third area is on durable peace, both in Ghana and sub-regionally.
Right.
Ghana has a strong history of being a peaceful nation, but it's surrounded by a lot of conflict at the moment.
You're concerned about that?
In all areas, from the Sahel, and even, as we know, the Gulf of Guinea
yes.
has some of the highest, well, the highest rates of piracy in the world, bar none. And so working on peace and security is important. And if you look at the foundational principles of the United Nations, it's peace, security, and development, right? And we know that without peace, actually, there is no development.
The belief is we should be supporting democratic institutions just to uphold and to keep up the morale just as we move on, because what we see is that democracy appears to be in recession in the West African sub-region. Do you share the same view?
Of course we do. Clearly we've had 3 coups and 3 changes of government undemocratically in the sub-region. And the President of Ghana has done a good job in terms of trying to rally the forces when he was chair of ECOWAS, and continues to push that. But we know that at the center of progress, I call governance, good governance, I call it the fluid that runs in the pipes, if you like, the grease. Right. Because without it, nothing will happen. And we see rises in protests when injustice, unfairness, inequity seems to be at its highest. And so for us, governance, transparency, accountability, these are threads that run through everything that the UN does. Ghana, like with being a peaceful country, also has an enviable track record on the continent around elections. The one thing I often say to Ghanaians is, please don't take this for granted. We have seen in many other countries, even within this sub-region, what taking peace for granted ends up meaning.
Charles, let's talk about the future for Ghana and the United Nations. What would that be?
Well, I think continuing collaboration. We certainly believe in expanded partnerships. We want to work through a number of the agencies who work in the economic sector, UNDP, UNCDF, UNICEF, and a number of others, FAO, WFP, to really support Ghana to expand its economic engine. And that's in two ways. One, it's about creating a pipeline of finance that will come into Ghana to support big initiatives like CARES or Batampa, One District, One Factory, planting for food and jobs and so forth, but also to build businesses that are capable of being fit for the future and ultimately competing globally. And so you will see a whole conglomeration of agencies, UNIDO, UNDP, and others I've said, who will work on that. Traditionally too, the UN has played a strong role in, if you like, ensuring that the safety nets are in place and that absolutely no one is left behind. And so traditional agencies who have worked in this space, UNICEF being one of them, UNFPA, a raft of others, ILO, will continue to push initiatives that are helpful for government. Again, all latched into what the government does. And around peace and security, and I often say these things are all interwoven. There are lots of initiatives that are in the footing. We're about to launch and design and launch a program that will work with the North. The argument has often been so much investment in the north of Ghana and yet no returns. Right. And I think a concerted effort with the Northern Development Authority across 5 of the regions, with development partners, with the private sector, this is going to be key, not just to economic growth and transformation, but also to assuring the peace and ensuring particularly that there are people who are not vulnerable anymore to being recruited into violent extremist groups and bringing the catastrophe that has happened in many other West African countries home to roost here.
And I would want us to wrap up on the preamble of the United Nations Charter. Right. It's people-centered, we the people of the United Nations. Yes. If there's a message to the people, what would that be?
I mean, at the end of the day, the United Nations, I've said that first and foremost, we all have to take responsibility as individuals and as nations. The Committee of Nations helps us, particularly to address issues that are transboundary in nature or global. And increasingly at the global level, you will see that context and prioritization around those issues, which is why you hear inequality, why you hear global climate crisis, why you hear global conflict, because it has impacts. And increasingly our work here at national level is to support countries to realize their own aspirations. I have always been impressed with the fact that Ghana is one of a very few on this continent who have at least articulated an ambition. And I think without that, you know, they say, once you know where you're going, then it's easier to get there. Yeah. And so our role really here is to support and be accountable to Ghana in the way that the UN leverages its global resources to support Ghana to achieve that ambition, to continue to nudge the government from here and there when it maybe has forgotten something, to ensure that we try to speak on behalf of ordinary Ghanaians. I think, as I said before, we want to expand our partnerships with civil society and the private sector, principally also built around the notion that Ghanaians are the best to articulate their needs to their governments. The UN is not here to act as an interlocutor for citizens on behalf of citizens. We're here to work around the priorities. And if we strengthen all of Ghana, then all of Ghana will become stronger as a result of that. And on this, I guess on this anniversary of the UN, our ambition is to look forward, mindful of all the challenges that are there, but to look forward to build trust. The Secretary General has said, we must earn our respect every single day. And that's the firm belief that we come to when we say we're committed to continuing to work with Ghana and walk the journey towards 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, that commitment is not only reaffirmed, but is expanded with the new cooperation framework that we look forward to signing shortly.
Yeah, and hope to see you here in Ghana in 2030, hopefully.
I
Thanks,
hope
Sogah,
so too.
for talking to us.
It's a pleasure speaking to you.